Hi, this is the free GMAT prep hour for July 12th, 2022. And my name is Dmitry Farber, and I'm the one who put this together, and I'll be your host. I want to talk about a master process for sentence correction today. Speaking of correction, let's start with an error. I put sentence correctio. That's pretty funny, given the context. Let's try that again, just to see if anyone noticed it before I did. How about that? So a master process for sentence correction. And obviously it's too good to be true it's too good to be true to hope that there's one way you could do every single sentence correction problem. That would be wonderful. But of course, if I could come up with that, then the GMAT would just have to change because they could never make it that easy. So there's a lot of flexibility we have to have in doing these problems, but there is a consistent approach I can apply. And what I try to do is get people away from what they traditionally do, which is look down at all the splits and the answer choices, and obsessing over all the differences, and focus more on, does a sentence work at its core? Where do the errors pop up that I can spot, that I can cut out? And that's what I'm going to spend a lot of time on today, both in the sentence core, the underlying grammar, the subject and the verb, the object, and then the modifiers that are attached, and when necessary, the meaning of the sentence. Does it make sense? So let's talk about the idea of a sentence core. Basically, what we're looking for when we read a sentence most of the time, and I encourage people to do this just very, very consistently, even if they have to get worse before they get better. In other words, even if you have to slow down and be more awkward and spend more time thinking about these questions than you otherwise would, it's worth working through that to the other side, as long as you have enough time before your test date that you can get back through and get better again. What I want to be able to do is find the core of the sentence, meaning if I strip out all the modifiers, all the adjectives and adverbs, all the ins and ofs and bys, all the other things that just add description or detail, and say, what's the underlying subject of the sentence? What action is that subject performing? And then does that work? So take a moment to read this sentence. And then I want to know, what is the subject of the sentence? Who or what is acting or doing something in this sentence? What do we think? What's our subject? The system, right? System is our subject. Generally speaking, the first noun that we see, person, place, or thing that we see, is going to be the subject of the sentence unless it's inside a modifier. So if I say outside the hotel, a hotel is a noun, but I'm saying outside the hotel, and you're waiting, what happened outside the hotel? But if I just start with a noun, the hotel, John, the system, right? Then that's my subject. Now we want to say, okay, what did the system do? So what's my verb for the system? The system did what? Sometimes people get faked out by the word right next to the system, which is created. Created certainly sounds like a verb, right? You create something, you created it, but the system didn't create anything. And how can we tell? Partly just meaning wise. Am I saying here that the system itself created something? Judging from the sentence overall, I don't seem to be. But it's also the way it's structurally placed. It says created by. So a system didn't create something by something else, it got created. And it's very, very extremely common that the GMAT will use these past tense forms of verbs as modifiers. This is a very normal English thing to do. And so I'm saying the system created by the team of engineers, that's all a modifier. Modifiers are things that for the time being, we're going to strip out. We're just going to say, I'm going to ignore this. And then I say have worked. And then I have another modifier more effectively than previous systems. And we can worry about, when we see things like comparisons, more than, is the comparison being done correctly? And that's stuff we will think about a lot. But for the time being, I don't care. I just want to think about the core. And as you're probably noticing, the core is not very good, right? The system have worked. That's a problem. What the GMAT is hoping, if you're familiar with sentence correction, this might not have been super challenging for you. But what the GMAT is hoping is that you'll just go by ear and you'll see the system have worked. And by the time you get to have, you've thought of it engineers and all these other things, and you're just not worrying about the fact that system and have don't fit together, right? The system is singular and have is plural in this context. So that's a problem that we can avoid by stripping out the modifiers. Now, I started by saying, what's a subject, what's the verb? Realistically, though, when you're reading a sentence, you don't want to ask, what's the verb? You just want to say, where does the core begin? Usually, not always, as we'll see, but usually it starts with a subject. And then what's the next part of the sentence that I can keep? I'm going to cut out anything that's a modifier, and I'm going to leave everything that is not a modifier. Sometimes you might have multiple verbs, and so we have to be ready for variations. So I can't always just say, I need a subject and a verb. But at the minimum, I'm going to have one subject and one verb to have a sentence. So typically when we talk about a sentence core, we're talking about the subject of the sentence, possibly there's more than one, a verb, possibly more than one, an object, this is optional. Some verbs work by themselves. I can just say, I exercised all day, right? Exercise is the verb, and I didn't exercise something, I just exercised. Other verbs, maybe more commonly, will take an object. I ate lunch, I gave someone some money. So there's both an direct and an indirect object, right? I gave the money to a person. I can have other extensions like, I believe that you exercised all day. So it builds, that builds on more structure to the sentence. And we can see some examples. But what we're doing is we're avoiding all the modifiers, the EDs when they're not actual verbs, the INGs, the adjectives, the adverbs, all the prepositional phrases of, by, in, for. And we could do a whole 3-hour session just on modifiers. But the trick is getting used to spotting what's not essential to the core of the sentence and reading past that so you can see the underlying structure. So here, if I can see, hey, that I really want to say the system has worked, then I know have is wrong. So if this were multiple choice, which of course they always are on the real test, then you might see answers that say has and answers that say have. Or you might see 5 completely underlined sentences with different subjects and verbs. One might say the systems have, and then have is suddenly okay. So we have to be flexible. But what I'm trying to avoid is the situation where I get overly focused on the answer choices and choosing among them before I've seen, does this thing even work? And the more comfortable you can get with noticing on a line-by-line basis whether a sentence works, the more quickly you can power through these. And while you're being quick, the more accurate you can be. Okay, so here's an extended version of the same sentence. Take a moment to read this. So here we can see that we have a lot of the same pieces, including the same error, but we also have a different subject. So we have this initial subject, most users. Then what do we have? We have a modifier within the organization. I can tell it's a modifier because it's a preposition. Prepositions, like I said, of, in, by, throughout, across, describe relational information, positions. They add detail to nouns or to verbs, but they don't serve as part of the structural core by themselves, even though they might be really important to the meaning. You might not know which users we're talking about if you don't say within the organization. So we're not saying that these are completely useless. They're often very important, but for our structure, for our grammar, we don't need them. Just like if you're going to live in a house, you probably want furniture, you want a bed, you want a couch. Those are important. But when you're buying a house, you're not looking at the bed and the couch because you're going to have your own usually. And you're just looking at, do I want to live in this building, right? And that's kind of what we're doing. We're looking at the underlying structure. So here we'd say most users feel, so we have subject and verb, and then we have this that. And after a verb, a that typically serves to reset our structure and say, hey, I need a new subject and new verb. So we have most users feel that the system, new subject, and then we have the same thing created by the new team engineers have worked, right? So we have the same core, except we have this add-on. And I could do this all day. You could say, I know that most users feel that the system has worked, right? Should say has. And then you could say, I didn't realize that you knew that most users feel that, we could keep doing this, that. The GMAT won't do anything that long and obnoxious, thankfully. But you can extend a sentence this way by just saying subject, verb, that, and then a new subject and verb, right? As long as it makes sense together. So to fix it, we're going to want to change that have to has, but expect that reset button when you see a that after a verb. It's saying the core is going to start over. We're going to have a new subject. Okay, questions on any of that so far? Okay. Let's play with some more variations. Let's think about what our core is here. Most users within the organization feel that the system created by the new team of engineers and the hardware introduced this summer have worked more effectively than previous offerings. So we have a lot of the same elements. What's different? We still have most users within the organization's a prepositional phrase, feel, reset button, that, the system, modifier created by the new team of engineers, and the hard. Now here I have to think, when I see and after a noun like this, I don't automatically know whether it's created by the new team of engineers and by someone else, or whether it's another thing that goes with the system. And so one thing we have to watch, and might not seem like that exciting a word, but it signals that some part of the sentence is parallel. Some part of the sentence is connected to something that came before, and I have to read it carefully to see what they mean. So I say by the new team of engineers and the hardware introduced this summer. Oh, okay, well, the system can have been created by the team and by the hardware. That doesn't make sense. So they must mean that this is part of the core, that the system and the hardware, and then that modifiers introduced this summer, have worked more effectively. So now, notice what I have is a compound subject, right? So within the organization is modifying users, created by the new team of engineers is modifying system, introduced this summer is modifying hardware. It would be nicer if this was next to it, okay. And then more effectively in the blah, blah is modifying worked. So these are all different kinds of modifiers. Most of them are modifying nouns, like users, system, hardware, and then more effectively than is modifying a verb, worked. So that makes it an adverbial modifier. We'll talk about that another time. So in this case, notice we don't have to fix anything because we have a compound subject. We have basically a plural. The system and the hardware have worked. But notice that the GMAT doesn't always make things easy on us, because we have to figure out what that and the hardware goes with. Sometimes that's not clear. Sometimes it's so unclear that the sentence has to be scrapped. Sometimes there isn't something for it to work with, or there's some other problem that is created. But here we have a compound subject. And if you have a compound subject, that it's normal and correct to have a plural verb. So here we wouldn't change have to has, we'd leave it alone. Okay. Another variation that you could see is a sort of a backward sentence. And these ones tend to bother people a lot. So I'm going to take a moment just to acknowledge their existence. Mostly we don't talk like this in real life, but the GMAT might say something like, more effective than previous offerings was the system developed by the new team engineers. Here, if I'm waiting for the subject, I'm going to be waiting a long time. I'm going to say more effective. That sounds like an adjective. Than previous offerings was, I've got a verb, I haven't had a noun, was the system. So it sounds like a backwards thing, like saying dark was the night. It almost has like a Yoda kind of feel to it. But they will sometimes write things this way on the test. And the idea here is that the subject is the system and the verb is was, and then more effective is what the thing was. So this is a bit of a backwards construction. Usually the GMAT will do this when there's a very long modifier to follow the subject that they think might get in the way. Here they might not do it. Like on a real GMAT question, the right answer might phrase this a bit more conventionally. But imagine that after system, there was a very long phrase. More effective than previous offerings was a system created in 1956 by an engineer at Bell Labs who realized that blah, 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 and they have this long thing. And so they're wanting to say that it was more effective before they've told this whole long story, so that by the end you're going, wait, what was more effective? So sometimes they do it to get the subject and verb closer together than they would otherwise be. You can even see this with a compound. So I might have more effective, they should say, offerings, okay? But more effective than previous offerings was the system developed by the new team of engineers and the hardware introduced this summer. So notice now, other than the word offering, which is no good, what else here has to change? That. Here we're back to what we saw earlier with a plural, we need were. More effective were the system and the hardware. So again, it's a sort of backwards construction where the subject comes after the verb. If you don't love this, the good news is you won't see this all the time, but it does happen. It does sometimes show up. And so you have to be ready for a sentence that doesn't start with the subject, right? Sometimes that happens. Okay, questions there? Okay, let's see if we can do this on a bit longer sentence. So your job is to try on your own for a minute and say, what's the core? If I ignore the prepositional phrases, the ofs, ins, withins, throughout, the modifiers of other kinds, adjectives, adverbs, eds that aren't verbs, ings, those kinds of things. What is left in my sentence? What's my core? So take a moment to try it. This is complicated a bit by the fact that the core here isn't very good, right? So we can start with the subject because it does start the more traditional way with the subject, the guidebook's ranking, or if you just like the ranking, either way, the ranking, and then of the new hotel just describes ranking. Of is a preposition, which will basically always be a modifier of a noun. So it's what it advertises. Well, let's see, the hotel advertises itself as a peaceful oasis. Then I've got this part that says taking into consideration. Normally I'll see that as a modifier. And so I'll say, okay, taking into consideration, yes, yes, yes. But then they have this weird part that says, and positions it's the hotel as one of the top recommendations in the city. And then I've got despite this other thing, this is another modifier. So I've got this strange things where I'm trying to find the core, but I've got a problem. I've got the guidebook's ranking or the ranking and positions the hotel. So I must have had a verb before the and for this to make sense. But I don't seem to have, I say which advertises, but the guidebook doesn't advertise itself. That's not a verb for guidebook, that's which advertises. Taking into consideration, maybe they meant for this to be part of the sentence, right? This taking, maybe that's supposed to be a verb. And so then I might scan for answer choices that fix this. And I might find one that's written more like this. The guidebook's ranking takes not only its comfort, but also its location into consideration, right? Or it takes into consideration this, but also that. And it positions the hotel. So you could think of the largest structure here as the ranking takes something and positions something. And then what does it take? It takes into consideration all this and it positions the hotel. Okay, so here we have subject, verb, and other verb. Whereas before we had subject, blah, 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 modifier, modifier, and verb, not possible, right? And pretty soon we'll get to these with answer choices, because obviously that's what you'll see on test day. But I want to make sure we're getting some practice just scanning for sentence core. Questions, concerns there? Okay. Now, what if I start with something different? Built as part of the new sports and entertainment complex, the guidebook's ranking of the new hotel, what does this do for us here? If I start with this phrase, built as part of the new sports and entertainment complex, what should I be expecting next? Normally, I'd be looking for what was built. And then what's interesting is that the next part that I see says the guidebook's ranking. So you want to watch out. Once you've got the core, the other thing you might notice is how the modifiers interact with the core. And that's what we're going to look at quite a bit. However, when a sentence starts with a modifier like this, if it jumps out at me as really obvious, then maybe I'll start by just crossing that out. And that's where we need a little bit of flexibility, right? Sometimes I tell people, it's like if you were in charge of hiring for a company, you might start most naturally with looking at the stack of resumes and cover letters and who meets the qualifications for the position. Okay, you need this much experience, or you need this, or you need to have applied by the deadline, or whatever it is. And you just cut the people who just don't qualify at all. You start there before you worry about subtler differences, and you care where they went to school and how well worded their letters of recommendation are and things like that. But you start with the very mechanical things. But if there are any immediate disqualifiers of other sorts that you notice, then great, right? If I came in to turn in my resume and I was acting hostile and unstable when I turned it off, you're not going to hire me probably, right? So you would just toss that one, immediately. And so if I see right at the beginning, there's a modifier that doesn't work, cut the whole thing, right? Cut the whole thing. So whenever you notice it, you do it. But you can still always start with the idea that you're going to look for the core. But if something leaps out at you as, hey, this is wrong, I wrote my resume in crayon on the back of a piece of junk mail or something, then you don't have to read it, right? You can just stop there. Okay. So modifiers show up quite a lot. I'm not going to do a whole lesson on modifiers today because, like I said, it's its own whole subject. But I want to take a look at a few just a moment. So my question for these four is, each of these has a modifier. And our job with modifiers is to figure out, hey, how does this little piece of the sentence add to the meaning? What is it describing, and does it describe that thing correctly? So the question is then, which of these are okay? And which of these cause a problem? So take a moment to read these four and think about which of them have a problem with how the modifying portion applies to the rest of the sentence. Oh, I'm so sorry. I was off audio. Let's try that one more time. Okay, so what I was saying here was, thank you. Which of these do you think have flaws? I saw a vote for 1, 2, 3, 4. Other opinions about which of these might need to be fixed? Okay, so if we look at number 1, what we have is this noun modifier. When I see who, which, or that after a noun, it's usually applying to that preceding noun. The program who, a program can't want something. A program can be designed to do something, or it can do something, but a program can't want something. And so even though you might argue, well, hey, I know who wanted to reduce poverty. It's the president. It's clear enough to me. The president is the only person in the sentence, so who has to refer to the president? Problem is that we don't just go on the GMAT with what we think the author wanted to say, we go with what they did say. And if I say the program who, it creates a bit of a problem, even though I know what they mean, right? So I'm going to cut number 1 out. 2 is a little sneakier because on 2, I see the company who wanted, which might still seem wrong. Maybe a company can have goals, but it seems a little strange for a company to want something. But you might say, but wait, hold on, maybe it's the president of the company who wanted. And what you'll find is a lot of people learn this in a very kind of rote way. They say, okay, and I've been guilty of kind of pushing this too far myself sometimes. They'll say, all right, when I see a who or a which or that, it has to refer to the noun right there. But the GMAT doesn't always do it that way. So sometimes the GMAT will refer to a noun that's a little bit removed. Maybe you have to jump over a quick modifier. Or maybe it'll see the whole thing as one thing. President of the company is one thing. Sometimes I've even seen a who or a which after a verb, which is strange. So you have to go back a little bit, right, and see what we're talking about. Normally we'll modify the nearest noun, but we need some flexibility. And here I would argue that this is fine. And one reason that I would argue it's fine is there's not a great way to fix it, right? I'd have to really drastically reword this to get who next to president, because it would be weird to say the president who wanted to reduce poverty of the company. That's even weirder. Am I reducing the company's poverty now? That's a pretty normal goal, I guess, but that's not, doesn't sound like the same as reducing actual poverty among people, right? I could rearrange it very differently. The company started a program to reduce poverty at the urging of the president. And sometimes a sentence will reword like that to avoid a problem. But here, I think it's clear enough that who can refer to the whole phrase, the president of the company. So we have a little bit of flexibility in applying these noun modifiers. Now, when you see an initial modifier, it's generally going to want to play nicely with what comes next. These comma ing words are often not meant to design to modify nouns, but to modify actions or clauses. So they sort of say why you did something. So we could argue they aren't meant to modify a noun at all, but they still leave us wondering, well, who wanted to reduce poverty? So if I read number 3, I could say, wanting to reduce poverty, the president, okay, I can see that the president wanted to do that. Whereas if I see here in 4, wanting to reduce poverty, the president's new program, well, wait a second, now it's not the president. President's is just a modifier for program. So this is saying wanting to reduce poverty, the program, that creates a problem. So generally speaking, when you see an initial modifier, especially like a comma ing kind of thing, or it could be a noun like an expert in forensic science, comma, you're waiting to see who is that person or who was wanting to do that. And if it says wanting to reduce poverty, the program, that creates a problem. Wanting to reduce poverty, the president, that works. You'll notice that when it doesn't work well with the noun, it's not going to work well with the verb either. Here, you could argue that wanting to reduce poverty really modifies the verb. It's like why the president started a new program. Hey, I started a new program. Why? Because I want to reduce poverty. In fact, I could rewrite this sentence that way, and this would be fine. I could say the president of the company started a program, new program, wanting to reduce poverty. I can move that over because it just shows why the president started that program. Whereas here, notice if I put wanting to reduce poverty at the end, it wouldn't help. The president's new program was a great way to help, comma, wanting to reduce poverty. You still might be going, wait, who is wanting what, right? This wouldn't work well with this verb, was a great way to help, because the program wasn't a great way to help because it wanted to reduce poverty. Still doesn't work. It's got to work with the subject of the verb we're talking about. Okay, so that leaves us with 2 and 3 as possibilities. So this is something that we'll usually look at after we've done the core, because the core is the most reliable thing we can say, not always the easiest, sometimes, but the most reliable thing we can say, this must work. And then we can expand to look at modifiers as needed. And then if there's anything left, we can look at meaning. So to outline a general process for sentence correction that you can use, and as I said earlier, this is a little bit different from what we outline in our courses in our books. This is one place where I teach something a little bit differently from the materials. All of this is consistent with what we teach and the rules. I'm not contradicting anything, but I'm suggesting a different priority and process than the way we do it in there. And there's that sentence correctio again. It's very, I don't know, that has like a Latin or like Harry Potter ring to it that I wasn't really going for. Let's try that again. Okay, so starting with sentence core, we're saying, what is the core? Right? What's the subject, the verb, maybe an object, an extension, and then is there subject verb agreement? I don't want a singular match for the plural. Does the core function as a complete sentence? Does it work? And the reason I say even if vague is I might say something like, if you cut out the modifiers, I might say something like, I like sandwiches better than sandwiches. And you might say that doesn't make any sense at all. How can you like sandwiches better than sentences? That's not logical. That's not. But if you recognize that there are modifiers in the sentence that you've just stripped out, maybe there's modifiers describing the kind of sandwiches you like. Oh, I like, veggie sandwiches better than meat sandwiches, or, it could be long, I like sandwiches with lots of spice and flavor better than sandwiches that are, mild and, this kind of thing. So I just want to see, does this work structurally? And this works, even though this is a funny sentence to say, structurally works. You can like a thing better than another thing. Okay, fine. And then we're looking for parallelism if there are parts that are linked or structured in relation to each other, like the sandwiches and sandwiches here. Do they work the same way in the sentence? Right? I can't like sandwiches better than eating sandwiches, for instance, right? I can't like a noun more than say a verb or an activity. So I'll look at that first and cut as many as I can. If I'm lucky, that'll get rid of all the wrong answers. That sometimes happens. Majority of the time it doesn't. But usually I would say it's pretty normal that we'll get rid of a couple this way, but it just really depends on the question. Then I'd look at modifiers. One at a time, looking at the modifiers, whether it's an initial modifier or a modifier later in the sentence. Does this apply clearly and correctly to the sentence and its current placement? Does it make sense? Is it modifying the right thing? Are there errors in the way it's put together? Inside the modifier itself, maybe it creates a problem with subject verb within the modifier. Maybe there's some other error in phrasing. Does it work with the sentence as a whole? Maybe in the modifier, I use a plural, and somewhere in the sentence, I use a singular, and I've got to watch that for that. And then does it even maybe conflict with other modifiers? I won't have to do a lot of that, but sometimes that shows up. And then if there's anything left, then I might think about little things like meaning, other things show up, idioms, what turn of phrase is best. But what I'm trying to do is get as many out for very technical but concrete reasons where I can say, no, this is wrong, right? Using my hiring analogy, before I worry about like who seems really cool or professional, and that's a very touchy-feely, kind of vague kind of way to decide. I want to start with who has the qualifications that we need, who's available, right? Those kinds of things. And that's going to be a very reliable way where I'm going to say, hey, if someone's not qualified, then I can't hire them. Or if someone's not available to work, then they could be the most wonderful person in the world and we're not going to hire them. They're not available. And so I'm trying to get rid of the answers that I simply can't choose. So I don't spend a lot of time worrying about little differences. And so that I'm very likely to pick the right answer, or at least I'm not going to be too quick to cross out the right answer and leave myself stuck with only wrong answers remaining. So let's try this whole process on a few official questions from MBA.com. I'll give you a poll to put this in, but what I want you to do before you choose an answer is see if you can explicitly identify to yourself what the core is. And if you're watching this on YouTube, you can pause it as much as you need to say, where's my subject, verb, what parts are modifiers that I can strip out, and how do I use that rather than just going straight to the answer choices? How do I use that to knock some choices out? Okay, give this a try, and whenever you're ready, you can select an answer from the poll. Okay, if you haven't already, go ahead and select an answer, pull one in if you can, or write one down on your paper to make sure you're committed before we talk about it. Seeing some agreement in the answers I've got so far, and this is one that you might get with a pretty traditional approach because we do see this clear split in the answer choices between has and have, singular and plural. And you might be able to spot that without any fancy technique. And that makes this problem a little nicer than some of the ones that we might see. But using the core approach, I think it's really important to go back and say, hey, if this sentence, maybe this is a sentence I would have quickly gotten right, on my own. How can I now analyze it this way to make sure I'm seeing why it works with the technique that we're using? Because if I can't do it on a sentence that I'm getting right, I'm really not going to be able to do it on a sentence that I'm struggling with. So I'd say, okay, very first word is a noun, efforts. Efforts might not always sound like a noun because it's not like a thing, but it's an abstract noun. It's something that was done. And then to has various uses, right? I can have an infinitive verb, like I want to sing, to sing. Here, to equalize sounds like a verb, but it's describing what efforts to equalize. So efforts to equalize the funds, and then available to school districts is modifying funds, right? So efforts are to equalize, and available to school districts is modifying funds. And then a major goal of education reformers in many states, this is all describing these efforts. These efforts are a major goal. So modifier, modifier, modifier has not reduced the gaps. Verb, object. So subject, verb, object has not reduced the gaps. And then existing between the richest and poorest districts, another modifier. I don't need to worry about that right now. So I could say, efforts has, not going to buy that. And again, the GMAT writers are hoping that by the time you get to the verb, even though you know not to say efforts has, you may just not be thinking about that subject anymore. So we'll cut out has and we'll keep have. So right away, that subject verb agreement issue got us down to 2, which is what we want. And then I can say, okay, what's the core of these? One says efforts have not reduced the gap. So that sounds a lot like what we said, it just fixes the problem. E says have not been significant. So notice this is different. It has a different verb, been significant. That's not inherently wrong. So we want to make sure we're open-minded. We don't just say, hey, that doesn't sound like what A said. There's nothing special about A. A was wrong anyway. Who cares what it said? We just want it to work. So then I'd say have not reduced the gap. Okay, have not been significant in a reduction of the gaps existing. And then I can start getting into all these things. This is this is where people pull out one of my least favorite terms, the O word, overthinking. They'll say, I'll start overthinking it. And I know what they mean. I think there's other ways to describe that, other ways to get around the problem. Sometimes when we say we're overthinking things, it's just a way of shutting down analysis. Well, what do I need to do differently? But I think what does happen, and where I do understand where people use that term, is that there's just so many things I could look at. Do I want to say have not been significant or have not reduced the gap significantly? And do I want it to be singular gap or plural gaps, or the gap that exists or the gaps existing? And the answer is there may be many ways to say this, and I don't want to look at all of it if I don't have to. So I might kind of come at it from two perspectives. I might say, hey, D sounds a lot like what I was saying before. I don't see a problem. Efforts have not reduced the gap that exists between the richest and poorest districts. Maybe since there's plural districts, maybe there are multiple gaps, but this could be right. Significantly can modify reduce. That seems okay. Whereas here it's saying efforts have not been significant, and that's a little confusing. Does that mean that there hasn't been a reduction? Or does that mean there's been a reduction, but these efforts have not been a major part of it? So it's a little confusing what they mean. And then when I say significant in a reduction of the gaps, it gets especially confusing. And so that creates a problem of meaning at this point, where I don't quite know what they mean when they say significant in a reduction. Does that mean there's a reduction going on that this is a part of? And so I'm going to go with the simpler way to say it in this case, and I'll go with D. But this is where I have to take a bit of a gamble. A lot of people might feel pretty comfortable saying they like D. D doesn't seem to have a flaw. E might just sound funny to you. I try not to lean on sound funny, but if I have a choice that works and it's simple, and I have another choice that adds some complexity, and I don't see how that complexity is adding to my understanding of the meaning, then I'll cut it. Right? So that's how I would do this. One thing that the other choices all might help to clear up, even though I've cut them out, is that A and C both also stress the idea of actually reducing something significantly. B does say significant in reducing the gap. But I think what most of them are saying is that they haven't reduced it significantly. So it's clear that they haven't reduced at all. Whether it has been reduced is another story, but these efforts haven't done it. And that's what we want. Okay, so that's leaning mostly on subject verb. Other questions, we won't be able to lean as much on subject verb. We'll have to look at other things. But there are some complications you might see even when you are dealing with a lot of subject verb. So let's do another one where we can look at that process. Try this one. Same thing, see if you can spot the core before you pull anything in. Okay, this one may have been a bit more challenging. Let's see what we got. Put in an answer even if you're not 100% sure. If you're watching it as a recording, write something down just so you're committing. Okay. So notice here we have this initial part that says, while larger banks can blah, 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 blah. So we can treat this as a modifier, even though it has a subject and verb in it. It says banks can afford. It has this while that indicates, hey, this isn't my main action. It's like, hey, while this is true, now I have a new subject. Many smaller regional community banks, if you want to shorten that down, you might just say many banks. I do that in blue. That's how I usually do it. Many banks are finding that, and there's our that again. Remember, that is a reset button. It says, hey, look for the subject again. Look for a new subject. Many banks are finding that the cost, and then again, associated can be a verb. Like I can say, she associated with known criminals or something like that, right? But here, the cost isn't associating something, it's getting associated. The costs associated with upgrading and are prohibitive. So some people will go straight to this answer choice and say cost or costs, cost or costs. And there are ways to think about this that are different. You might think about the meaning. It sounds like maybe there's more than one cost. You're upgrading data processing equipment and you're developing and maintaining products. That sounds plural to me. But that gets tricky because you could say, oh, well, do I know it's plural? Could there be one cost that you pay to someone for all? And you start thinking about all these possibilities that you don't want to. So if I just know it says are, then I know it has to be cost. I don't have to spend any time thinking about the deeper meaning. I can just say, I can't say cost are. That's not an option that I have. Now, unfortunately here, I have three choices to make: associated with, arising from, and of. So in this context, I'd have to think about what idiom, what expression I want to use. Sometimes this is just a matter of what the GMAT is expecting us to say in the context, but you could argue here that any of these could be right. I could say the cost of upgrading, but no one picked that. I saw a lot of support for B. Why? What makes B a better choice than the others in this particular context? Sometimes it's a matter of what other structure we have. And this gets back to our idea of parallel as a parallel structure. When I see this and with the development, it requires something else before it. Just like earlier when we had a verb and a verb, we need another verb before it. Here, if we say and with, you're saying, what does the with mean? It only makes sense if we've said associated with. If I said of, the cost of upgrading and with the development, then what would that with talk about? What do you mean a cost of upgrading and with the development? The with only works if we've set up this structure of associated with this and with that. So associated with upgrading and with the development. So that's an example of parallelism within a modifier. So we used our sentence core to cut out A and D. And then it looked like B, C, and D was just like, well, what do you want to use? What do you want to do? What expression do you like? When it really turned out to be about parallelism within the modifier. Okay. Let's do something that's going to take us even further away from the simple core. Here's one where a lot of the cores will work and we have to look at something else. See what you can do with this. Let's get an answer in for this one, even if it feels a bit guessy. A little bit more divided on this one. I think you could argue that this is a bit tougher. If I were to look for sentence core here, I'd say, okay, it starts with a modifier, unlike blah, 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 blah. So I could cut that out for now. It starts with this kind of funny phrasing. There is a disinclination. And then modifier on the part of many people to recognize the degree to which their analytical skills are weak. So it's funny that by itself, the core doesn't say much. There's a disinclination to recognize the degree. A disinclination among whom? To recognize what degree? But structurally, you could say this is the underlying core of the sentence. And although it doesn't say much, it doesn't actually have a flaw, right? So if I were just looking at this, I might say, oh, that's all right. And then B, unlike, and then another modifier, which they admit they lack. Many people are disinclined to recognize that, there's our reset button, their skills are weak. I might like the phrasing of B better, it's more direct. But A wasn't actually wrong in that sense. C, unlike computer skills, analytical skills, or so just skills or analytical skills, bring out a disinclination. All the rest is a modifier of some kind. Many people willing to admit that modifier are disinclined to recognize that their analytical skills are weak. And many people have a disinclination and then to recognize the weakness, all that's a modifier, right? So these are all written very differently. And here's where the core approach abjectly fails, right? Abjectly fails. I couldn't get rid of a single core. Some I might like better than others. Some might seem like a nicer way to say this sentence, clearer, but none of them break a grammatical rule, so I'm not going to cut them. Does that mean I would do all this and write this down on my paper? And certainly, of course, I'm not actually highlighting on the test. It's just a tool right now. We're not going to have that tool available to us when we're taking the test. But if I'm recognizing these cores, I might say, hey, these are all okay. But I actually might stop long before this if I recognize that right at the beginning I have a modifier issue. So again, it's like the red flag that jumps out on my application where you don't even have to read my resume to say, nope, not this guy, right? So if I start with unlike computer skills, my question then is, what's unlike computer skills? We saw this earlier, right? We saw an initial modifier that had to match with what followed. Wanting to reduce poverty, like who wanted to do it? Okay, so if I say unlike computer skills, there is immediately wrong. I just say unlike computer skills has to modify a thing that's unlike computer skills, and there is does not cut that. Immediately out. B says unlike computer skills, and then it says which they admit they lack. I'll hold off and say, okay, do I know who they is? So far, I don't. That seems a little funny. But then it says many people. Well, many people compared to computer skills doesn't make much sense either. C is a little better. Unlike computer skills or other technical skills, analytical skills, hey, that seems all right. I can see how analytical skills could be unlike computer skills. I'll buy that. D doesn't have this modifier. It says many people willing to admit they lack computer skills or other technical skills are disinclined to recognize, all right, that might work. Willing to admit seems to modify the people, although it's really modifying their action, but it works together. The people are disinclined, even though they're willing to admit. That might work. And then I'll look at E. Many people have a disinclination to recognize. Okay, so this modifies to recognize. All right, they're disinclined. And what are they recognizing? The weakness. What weakness? Of their analytical skills, while willing to admit their lack of computer skills or other technical skills. So here, notice that they have while willing, but we don't have another verb that really, or another phrase that really creates the right context or contrast there. So let me make that a little clearer. So if I said, for instance, imagine saying at the beginning, while willing to do this, the manager refused to do that, right? Like I'll just say X and Y. So it's describing the manager's willingness to do one thing, but not another. But here, they don't quite have that. They say they're willing, while willing to admit their lack of computer skills at the end. It's comparing that to having a disinclination. It doesn't really make the meaning, it doesn't state that meaning very clearly, right? So I'm not loving E, but I might feel a little queasy about throwing it out. So I might look at some of these other ones again. C has the modifier I wanted, unlike computer skills, analytical skills. But C, notice, says analytical skills bring out a disinclination in many people to recognize that they are weak. So this is very strange. First, it's like, can my skills bring out a disinclination? Can my skills themselves make me not want to analyze something? And then they is tricky because that might mean the people. I might say, hey, analytical skills make you not want to admit that you are weak. That's pretty weird. And so that creates a bit of a problem. And so down to D and E, I'd say, hey, D is fairly clear. Many people are disinclined to recognize something. And while they're disinclined to do that, they are willing to admit they lack computer skills or other skills. Whereas here, I have this weird contrast between having a disinclination and then a modifier while willing to admit. Those don't work well together. We don't have a nice modifier for our action or a set of parallel terms. I'll go with D. So that's a much harder question, right? Much harder question. And you might not feel entirely satisfied. There's a lot to work on here in terms of how we use modifiers, how we look at the core. So I can't pretend that, all sentence correction problems are solvable doing something that we can spend an hour on. But what I'm hoping is that you can feel more and more confident in this broad process, right? And the broad process is that as much as possible, you lean on something that you can feel certain about, which is sentence core. And you do that before you worry about other stuff like modifiers and meaning. So if you can get used to thinking in terms of this process and avoid getting lost in all the differences in the answer choices, even if at the end you're down to say D and E and you just don't know, at least you're down to D and E. At least at that point, if you've correctly gotten rid of ABC, you have a 50-50. And so you're avoiding the long times, the 2+ minute problems. These are meant to take about 1:20 to do, sometimes slightly longer, but you don't want to run to 2 minutes or you will run out of time very quickly on the test as a whole. And you avoid the situations where they all sound good or they all sound bad. You want to get in the situation where you're getting rid of as many as possible quickly and early. So sometimes that involves using the core, as we did. And other times it's less about the core and more about how the modifiers apply to the core. But even then, knowing where the core is tells you where the modifiers are not, tells you what to apply the modifiers to. It makes your whole process stronger. So it takes some practice, takes some doing for sure. But I think it's worth the effort. I've seen a lot of people who really struggle with sentence correction kind of get worse for a minute and then get really solid and reliable with this. And then I've seen other people who are actually pretty good at sentence correction. They're getting a lot of it right, but they're not getting any better. I've seen people kind of break it down and again, maybe get a lot worse for a minute, slower and more awkward and trying to, analyze things by rules that they were previously doing by ear. But once you get through to the other side of that, assuming you have a month or more to study, they often come out stronger and are more efficient, more confident in their choices, and are able to justify what they're doing in a way that they learn more from every problem that they do, rather than just go, yeah, that sounds right. And then strength builds upon strength. You do better on a problem, but then when you analyze the problem, you get more out of it, and that makes you stronger on the next one. That's what we want to do. Okay. Let me know if you have questions on that. Otherwise, would love to have you join us for one of our courses. Every class 1 that we teach is available as a free trial. So if you want to come by class 1 and check our class out, we'd love to have you. You can also check out our on-demand options. So best of luck to everyone with their studies. Anything you'd like to talk about, let me know. Other than that, have a great night, morning, whatever time zone you're in, and hope all goes well for you.